Few medieval queen consorts split opinion quite like Eleanor of Provence. On the one hand, she was a loyal queen to Henry III, defending him against rebels when needed, and being a powerful regent in her own right. On the other, she was hated for bringing her French relatives over with her to take people's jobs at court, and she was quite keen, it seems, on expelling Jewish people from her lands. These are facts about the woman, but is this a woman with a hideous personality hidden beneath her legendary beauty, or was she a product of her era? Eleanor's beginnings sound like the start of a children's fairy tale. She was born in Provence in 1223, although we don't know exactly when. She was one of 4 daughters born to Ramon Berenguer V, Count of Provence, and his wife Beatrice of Savoy. The couple had 2 sons born before Eleanor, possibly twins, but they both died young. The 4 daughters, Margaret, Beatrice and Sanchia, other than Eleanor herself, were famed for their beauty, and Eleanor would become known for her dark brunette hair and striking eyes. She was the youngest child, and despite her parents being somewhat impoverished for nobility, she still received a good education. Eleanor, along with her sisters, had the tutor Romain de Villeneuve, a senior official at her father's court. He was a trusted man who would go on to become Beatrice's guardian after Ramon's death, and it was through him Eleanor would gain a deep love of reading, which would follow her into adulthood. Provence, like much of France at that time, had a well-known troubadour culture that likely led to Eleanor enjoying romantic novels, and in adulthood she would have a particular penchant for Arthurian legends. They would also have learned their native tongue of Occitan, which was close to French, and would have learned to read and write Latin for the purposes of letter writing. They would also have learned to ride a horse, falconry, and all 4 women would be well versed in the fashion of the day. Her eldest sister, Margaret or Marguerite, had been her closest companion, but was married to the French king, Louis IX, when she was 12 in 1234. Her new mother-in-law, Blanche of Castile, had arranged the marriage specifically with the view that Marguerite was merely pretty and pious, wasn't politically savvy enough to attempt to wrest control from Blanche, and to increase the lands held under the French crown. Henry III, King of England, wanted to try to do the same, especially as his father, King John, had lost the Angevin lands once held by their family. Marrying the right Frenchwoman would help with his cause, or so he hoped. Marguerite's family had hoped that through her marriage they would be more involved in the French royal family and their politics, but after the bride travelled to Paris, her uncles and entourage were sent home, leaving her alone and under the manipulation of Blanche. The Count and Countess of Provence were irritated by the Queen Mother's treatment of them, and luckily for them, Blanche hadn't made friends in other places as well. Both Henry and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II were suspicious of her, and their own bond was further cemented when Frederick took Isabella, the king's sister, for his 3rd wife. Seeing where it would be possible to gain an advantage, Henry sent ambassadors to Provence to seek out a wife there. However, he was already going through the motions of marrying his distant kinswoman Joan, Countess of Poitou, and Blanche had already made clear she didn't want this marriage to happen anyway. When Eleanor's parents agreed to an English match instead, Joan was let go, and Henry made arrangements to marry Eleanor. Her parents were still unable to pay for a decent dowry, and Henry wrote no less than 6 letters for his ambassadors to present to the Count and Countess, starting at £13,333 and going down to £2,000. Eventually, he panicked they would refuse the match altogether on this basis, and the king wrote one final letter telling his envoys to forget altogether about the money and simply to come back with his future bride. This shows the tension and level of fear that circulated in Europe at this time over gaining lands and therefore resources, and how this was achieved through marriages as much as war. On the 23rd of November 1235 at Tarascon Castle, Eleanor went through the motions with a proxy marriage before travelling to England on the 15th of December. Henry was apparently nervous awaiting his bride, When Eleanor finally landed with her uncle, William of Savoy, and a large retinue of Savoyard relatives in Dover in early January, he rushed to Canterbury. It would have been the first time the couple had ever seen each other, and Henry's Anglo-Norman and Eleanor's Occitan would have been close enough for them to understand one another. He was around 28 and Eleanor was at least 12, possibly 13. They were married at Canterbury on the 14th of January 1236, and she became the Queen of England, Lady of Ireland, Duchess of Normandy and Aquitaine, and Countess of Anjou, although many of her titles relating to France were somewhat redundant and wouldn't be used after the Treaty of Paris in 1259. Despite their age gap, Henry was an attentive and caring partner to his young wife, and he had a special skill in putting people at their ease. Up until that point, the king's only attachments to the fairer sex had been his mother, his sisters, and 2 nuns, so he was quite shy with Eleanor romantically, a contrast to his father and forebears. She was crowned on the 20th of January, and the occasion was set with flags, banners and lanterns all across London, and a blue carpet was laid from Westminster Palace to the Abbey. Henry went first, with Eleanor following behind, her long hair loose and wearing a simple circlet on her head. Now officially queen, not only would her main role be to produce an heir for the English throne, but also to intercede with her husband on behalf of his subjects. Eleanor was immediately asked to appeal on behalf of William de Punchhall, a man who she didn't know, who had committed a forest offence such as poaching, and it was granted. This was almost a tutorial to guide the young queen through how she should act. Due to her age, Eleanor's education continued until she was old enough to participate fully in the systems of queenship, and this included being brought into Henry's religious leanings. He was known to be especially pious, particularly towards Edward the Confessor, who he adopted as his patron saint, and both Eleanor's medical care and religious guidance were entrusted to Nicholas of Farnham, who later became the Bishop of Durham. Henry was extremely religious, and he was eager that his wife should be just as into it as he was. Apparently, the pair were affectionate and caring towards one another, and Eleanor truly seems to have loved her husband and been a faithful and loyal wife, and Henry was a devoted husband. The proof of this can be seen in a rather shocking and horrific event, in which a man turned up at court claiming to be the real king and demanding Henry abdicate immediately. The king took pity on this man as he was clearly suffering from a mental illness, and he forbid anyone to harm the man as he was let go. It would be a grave error. Just a few nights later, the same man crept through the king's open window to stab him to death, but found an empty bed as Henry was sleeping with Eleanor in her chambers. Someone finally caught him creeping around, and this time he was taken to Coventry and quartered. Henry's switch in mercy was said to be not because the man had threatened to kill him, but because he had threatened to kill the Queen. But for all their happiness, there were fears for a short while that the young Queen might not be able to have children, when it's far more likely she simply didn't fall pregnant straight away due to her young age. However, she was finally carrying the future heir to the throne by Christmas of 1238, and although she had moved around constantly with Henry's court since her arrival, the king wanted his queen to remain at Westminster once the birth grew closer. Eleanor gave birth on the night of the 17th to the 18th of June 1239 to a boy named Edward after Edward the Confessor. Henry was overjoyed, as were most of his subjects, as young Prince Edward represented a secure passing of the throne, as well as the first king since the Norman conquest to be given an English name. Eleanor's churching, the first official ceremony for a queen which celebrated her return to public life after having a child, was arranged for the 9th of August, and London was flooded with noble women to attend on the Queen. One of these was Eleanor Plantagenet, the king's sister. She had been married once before and widowed before she was 20 years old. She had married for a second time to Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, who was also a close advisor and friend of the king. However, there were controversies surrounding their marriage, starting with the fact Eleanor had taken a vow of chastity after becoming a widow, and also for the fact they had been married in secret. Although it appears Henry was fully aware of the marriage and appears to have approved, giving them lavish gifts and allowing them to stay in his properties in London after they were married and had their first child, he wouldn't remain this way forever. As the Queen's churching approached, the king suddenly banned both his sister and her husband from attending the ceremony and threw them out of their London residence. It turned out Queen Eleanor's uncle, Thomas of Savoy, had come to the king with a large debt that, he said, Simon de Montfort owed him, and had put Henry down for the surety of it. The king had already paid out a huge amount of money for his sister's wedding, and now Simon had put him down for another £1,333. The real sticking point wasn't the amount, however, but the fact he had made a decision to put a debt to Henry's name without informing him or asking. It was an arrogant move, and despite both Eleanor and Simon coming to beg the king for forgiveness, he remained angry about what had happened. He then added that Simon was an excommunicated man, and that he had only agreed to the marriage to his sister as she had been seduced by de Montfort. He threatened to lock Simon in the Tower of London, and the couple fled to France. Queen Eleanor almost certainly would have mourned the loss of her sister-in-law as the two had grown close. The de Montforts had fled so quickly that they had to leave behind their baby son, who was being raised in the royal nursery alongside his newborn cousin Edward and another cousin of theirs, 4-year-old Henry. They would be followed by other royal siblings, all born before Eleanor was 23. Margaret, born a year later in 1240, followed by Beatrice in 1242, and Edmund in 1245, who would go on to become the founder of the first House of Lancaster. They also had one more daughter on the 25th of November 1253 named Catherine, and there are various sources alluding to the fact she was deaf and possibly had an intellectual disability. Whatever the case, Henry and Eleanor loved her the same as their other children, and when she sadly died at 3 years old in 1257, the pair were heartbroken at the death of their little daughter. The children would be raised at Windsor Castle, and both the king and Eleanor were doting and attentive parents, made clear both by the vehemency of their feelings and the fact that they often spent large amounts of time with their children, in opposition to what was expected of royalty at that time. Now comfortable in her role as queen, it wouldn't be long before Eleanor's relatives saw a way to ingratiate themselves into English politics as she grew into an adult. Her uncles William, Thomas and Boniface of Savoy had all used her influence with the king, but in 1241 it was her uncle Peter of Savoy who would throw himself into the role of Eleanor's advisor. The English courtiers who would normally have found a place amongst the staff at court were understandably jealous of the Savoyards, who now found themselves by the side of the king, and this was made worse by Peter's conduct. He did help Eleanor to strengthen her own position as mother of the future king, but he also used her help in gaining positions for more of their relatives. And this was made worse when the king's half-brothers travelled over from France to find there was little left of the pie for themselves. A year later, Eleanor accompanied Henry on what was to be an ill-fated expedition to Poitou and Gascony in 1242. Henry's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, had remarried and become the Countess of Poitou, and she had reassured her son that her new husband, Hugh de Lusignan X, would support Henry in reclaiming French lands. At that time, Hugh was involved in a rebellion against King Louis, and the rebels had hoped Henry would provide military support. However, the English king was slow in gathering an army, and considering the rebellion had kicked off in 1241, it was a year late. It was a slow campaign as well, and it wasn't helped by Hugh switching back to supporting Louis halfway through. Henry's army was surrounded by the French during the Battle of Taillebourg, and he had to retreat to Bordeaux after a one-day truce was agreed. His actions made Simon de Montfort openly criticise the king for his incompetence, another nail in the coffin of their strained relationship. As for Eleanor, she had remained at Bordeaux, having fallen ill during her pregnancy, and on the 25th of June 1242 she gave birth to their daughter Beatrice. She was also angry when she heard about the retreat, but for a slightly different reason to Simon. The truce had only been agreed as Henry's brother, Richard of Cornwall, carrying a pilgrim's staff, had entered the French camp and asked personally for the truce. In exchange, he demanded Gascony from his brother as his birthright of Poitou was now lost. Henry agreed in his desperation, except Gascony was supposed to go to his eldest, Edward, to rule while he waited to succeed his father. One can only imagine the arguments between man and wife. Gascony was withdrawn from Richard, and things grew somewhat heated between him and Eleanor as he suspected her involvement. Eventually things calmed down, but the memory of the event remained. However, the two could also work well together. When Henry left in 1253 to repress a rebellion in Gascony, Eleanor remained behind this time as regent, and Richard stayed on also as her chief advisor. Henry's trust in her cannot be underestimated, as she was even allowed to exercise the functions of the Lord Chancellor, a position that would not be held by a woman again until Liz Truss in 2016. Also, before Henry left on campaign, he drew up his will, instructing that Eleanor should be given full custody of their children and would hold the king's lands until their son Edward came of age. But aside from Henry's trust, there were other periods of Eleanor's regency that would be historic. One of these came on the 27th of January 1254, when for the first time, a woman acting as the head of state summoned and presided over Parliament. Although Richard was there also to give support, it was Eleanor who issued writs in her name, and it was Eleanor who led the Parliament through a diplomatic mandate. However, by April the 1st that year, Henry had signed a truce with his enemies. By December, the royal English couple were invited to Paris to spend some time with Louis IX and Queen Marguerite. But one issue with this truce was that their second son Edmund would now no longer receive the Earldom of Chester, and so finding something else for him became a problem. But Henry decided he had a solution. His second son would be the King of Sicily. The previous king, Frederick II, had died in 1250, and Pope Innocent was eager to give the throne to anyone but Frederick's heirs. So Edmund had been offered the throne, and the English king had accepted on his behalf. Eleanor also became deeply involved in this scheme along with her Savoyard relatives. The Pope dispatched his notary, Albert of Parma, to negotiate with Henry while he was still in Gascony, to find out when they could expect 9-year-old Edmund and the army he would need to travel to Sicily with. However, it quickly became clear that Henry was completely broke after his campaigns in France. But this was also a build-up of tensions from earlier events, especially those in 1255. Henry and Eleanor had increasingly grown worried about their 15-year-old daughter Margaret, who had married the 14-year-old Alexander III of Scotland, as she was not permitted by the Scottish to travel down to England. This was at least in part because the Scottish Minority Council, ruling until Alexander was of age, had split into factions not long after the marriage in 1251. But it was also partly because Margaret wrote home long letters full of homesickness and complaints that she was never allowed to see her husband, and therefore the Scots were worried Margaret might stay in England if she was allowed to return. The Queen's physician was sent to check on Margaret, and he was horrified to find her ill and pale, sending a letter home just before he died, shortly afterwards himself. Some thought perhaps of poison. The letter was alarming enough that Henry sent John Mansell and Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, and they surrounded Edinburgh Castle with troops and forced their way in. Margaret complained about not being allowed out of the castle, how she was given unfamiliar handmaidens, and again, how she wasn't allowed any time with Alexander. The two men fixed the third problem by putting the two young people together in the same bed and sent word back to England about her situation. Unsurprisingly, Henry came down hard on the two men who were meant to look after Margaret, and one of them, Robert de Ros, had to surrender Wark Castle near the Scottish border. Both Margaret and Alexander travelled there to meet with Eleanor and Henry, and Eleanor fell ill while at the castle, which meant her daughter was permitted to stay with her while the king and his son-in-law went north again to deal with the minority council. By late October 1255, Eleanor felt well enough to travel south again, and a bill was sent to the Bishop of Durham for her stay. Henry also took the opportunity to gather up income for Eleanor in the form of her Queen's Gold, an extra payment of 10% added on to fines paid to the crown. But this would be made worse by targeting the Jewish community within England. In late November, Henry ordered that the Jewish community in Lincoln pay out £172 from confiscated property. This property had belonged to Jews who had been accused of apparently kidnapping and murdering a young boy, throwing his body down a well, and had since been punished with hanging or imprisonment. The problem was that very little was actually known about the way the boy had died, and as so often happened in the medieval period, a scapegoat was decided on, and the finger was unjustly pointed at the Jewish population with no evidence. In 1257, Eleanor and Henry had to deal with the death of their youngest daughter Catherine, who was only 3 when she passed away on the 3rd of May. Matthew of Paris, a chronicler of the time, wrote that the little girl was speechless and helpless, but very beautiful in appearance, and added that Eleanor had something of a nervous breakdown. At the end of May, Henry had collapsed with a fever, but he ensured Westminster Abbey was completed in time to allow little Catherine to be the first member of the royal family to be interred there. Her tomb had a silver effigy on top and was encrusted with jewels. Her tomb has long since disappeared, but the way in which Henry and Eleanor reacted to her death shows the strong emotional bond they held with all of their children. By 1258, there were other matters to attend to, however. The crippling financial demands of the offer for Edmund to be King of Sicily had pushed the English populace too far, and it spilled over into rebellion. The Lusignans were actually behind some of this, and they led the English barons in a revolt. The king was broke, everyone was sick of the Sicilian business, the harvests failed that year, and even the church now had grievances. It wasn't until 7 of the English and Savoyard barons joined together, Simon de Montfort, Roger and Hugh Bigod, John Fitzgeoffrey, Peter de Montfort, Peter de Savoy and Richard de Clare, that things erupted. They formed an alliance with a view to pushing the Lusignans out of court, a move that was likely quietly supported by Eleanor, although it weakened her husband's power. Fearing he would be arrested, Henry agreed to abandon personal rule and instead rule through a council of 24 barons, although his own candidates included many of the hated Lusignans. In June, a fresh parliament passed the Provisions of Oxford, which further limited Henry's powers, and on top of that, Eleanor and her husband both had a falling out with their eldest son, Edward. She began to be seen as the enemy of reform. In 1261, Eleanor colluded with a small group of loyal activists who wanted to work with the king, and the Pope released Henry, Eleanor and their sons from needing to follow the provisions. By June 1263, tensions had risen further from this decision, and the rebels were now being led by Simon de Montfort. In retaliation for Eleanor's choices, they ravaged her lands and those of anyone who supported her, including her relatives. Civil war openly broke out, and Simon turned his forces on London. Henry and Eleanor were trapped within the Tower of London, but Eleanor did attempt to travel along the River Thames to her son Edward and his army at Windsor, but instead had to retreat as she found herself pelted with stones, rotten vegetables, and vicious insults by an angry London mob. They had been taught by this point to hate the Queen, and especially a foreign one. All the blame for the wrong of the country, claimed the rebels, was down to the overly large number of Savoyards in the government, and whose fault was that? However, this would also be Eleanor's greatest hour. The Royalists were defeated at Lewes in May 1264. While the rebels basically took power, although ineffectively, so they struggled to hold it well enough to actually take the country, it crippled Henry to little more than a figurehead. But his queen was not so easily daunted. A few months before, she had gone to France to seek support from Louis, and she found it, although this sparked the civil war as much as anything else. Her son Edward was now a hostage in Simon's hands, and Eleanor knew she would have to fight back to reclaim her son's birthright. Selling the crown jewels and borrowing heavily from every possible quarter, she travelled to Flanders to assemble an impressive invasion force. But unfortunately, she ran out of money while waiting for Simon to stop stalling over Edward's imprisonment, and her army dissipated. But she still wasn't done. The English Queen marched on Gascony, claiming it for herself as Duchess of Aquitaine. She once again raised another military force, smaller but just as loyal, and this, combined with her extensive network of contacts from France, the Papacy, Ireland, the Welsh Marches, and the English refugees in Europe, gave her the edge she needed. Eleanor was proof that diplomacy was just as effective a weapon as a sword when fighting an enemy, and her actions finally led to victory for the Royalists at Evesham in August 1265, and Simon was killed and mutilated by the victors. Just a few months later in November, Eleanor returned to her husband's side. There is no doubt that it was the Queen who had secured a victory for Henry, and furthermore, she even covered her debts from her time in Gascony by persuading the Pope to give her £60,000 from a fine taken from the English clergy. And certainly, finances would mark the later years of her life. She was markedly oppressive when it came to taxing the land she owned, but she also used the services of Jewish moneylenders while she was consort. However, she was a woman of her era, and she was hostile to Judaism, like many other medieval people. When Henry came back into power, he was much more infirm, and Edward took on a more prominent role. The king reversed many of the anti-Jewish laws Simon had put in place, but as his finances looked more dire, he was put under pressure from Parliament to restrict the sale of Jewish bonds to Christians in return for financing. But on the 16th of November 1272, Henry, who had been ill for a few years at this point, finally died. Eleanor was with him at the end, a final mark of her affection for her equally loving husband. She also became, upon his death, a very wealthy woman. However, with his death went any attempt at balance. Edward was crowned king on the 19th of August alongside his wife, Eleanor of Castile, yes, another Eleanor. Now a Queen Dowager, Eleanor of Provence stayed on in England and even helped to raise her grandchildren. When her grandson Henry died in her care in 1274, aged just 6, she was as heartbroken as she had been when Catherine had passed away. She founded Guildford Friary in his memory and gave orders for his heart to be buried there. The tragedies didn't end there, as her daughters Margaret and Beatrice soon passed away in the months following this. But the softer side of Eleanor soon gave way to her harder side, and on the 16th of January 1275, she received permission from Edward I to expel the Jewish people living in her lands. This was an event that would stick in the minds of many, and was used as an entire character basis for Eleanor. There was a sweeping wave of anti-Semitism across Europe, and Eleanor was swayed herself by the Franciscan and Dominican friars who urged people to expel Jewish communities. However, this is not necessarily indicative of her character, nor is there an obvious connection to the other measures Edward carried out against Jewish people in England that year. When we look at her personal life, it becomes more confusing, as Eleanor took at least one Jewish family into her protection, but was unable to help them when they were expelled from the country. On top of this, she remained a patron of a home founded by her husband for converted Jews. It suggests that in modern terms, we would certainly not like Eleanor's anti-Semitic leanings, but in her own time, it was complicated for her as she swayed between the average Christian teachings she was told were right and her feelings for actual people she knew. While Edward continued to value his mother's input on political matters, he was a far firmer king than his father had been, and Eleanor was probably a little put out that he didn't heed her more often. She began to make plans to retire, and in July 1286 she left for the nunnery at Amesbury to take the veil as a nun. Two of her granddaughters were already there, Mary of Woodstock and Eleanor of Brittany, who had both entered the priory at the age of 7 respectively. Just a few years later, on the 24th of June, 1291, Eleanor of Provence died. Although there was some confusion over where she should be buried, eventually her body was interred at Amesbury Priory on the 9th of September, her funeral attended by both of her sons, relatives and a host of nobility. Regardless of how Eleanor was remembered by her English subjects, she was revered by her children and family. Today, Eleanor is barely remembered at all, and if her name comes up, most people first think of the worst crimes attached to her name. But the real Eleanor of Provence was a fairly admirable figure if we view her, as we should with all historical figures, in the context of her time. She arrived in England as a young girl with no knowledge of what lay ahead, but she created a new model for queenship in her adopted country, creating a partnership between king and queen that would have implications for centuries afterwards in the English state. She was also formidable when it came to fighting for her place and that of her loved ones. Henry could be nothing but grateful to his wife, for it was her contacts, diplomatic ability and sheer stubbornness to back down that helped win the Barons' War in his favour and cement a royalist win, also securing the throne for their son. Much of the views surrounding Eleanor, that she was troublesome and apt to push her husband to war, also stemmed from a view held of Henry, that he was a gentle king who liked things easy and peaceful, therefore couldn't possibly be the one creating all the problems. Except Henry was determined from the start to win back what his father had lost in France, and marrying Eleanor was merely the beginning of that process. Between the two of them, they also created the first stable archetype of the royal family by being devoted and affectionate parents to their children, as well as continually fostering links between siblings and relatives. But it's impossible to ignore that Eleanor was of her era, a queen who put herself above average citizens because she was raised to believe in a God-given hierarchy, a woman who was anti-Semitic because of the Christian teachings of the day, and a landowner who was harsh on those who needed to pay her tax or queen's gold. She was therefore complicated, but also expected. But most of all, despite what we see as serious shortcomings, Eleanor provided an example of strong leadership and queenship, and deserves to be remembered not only for her few faults, but also for the impressive legacy she left for her children to follow. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.